This is the God, Man and Markets podcast, conversations on faith, culture and the economy.
Hello, my name is David Clayton. This is the second in our series of podcasts on the work of Ivan Illich, the writings of Ivan Illich. And I'm here with Charlie Deist, Michel Arcade, and Father Brad Elliott. So we're reading a second chapter from Ivan Illich's book, Shadow Work. And I'll go straight over to Michel again, who will just introduce this chapter and just tell us about it, Michel, and we will come in and comment. Extremely interesting, I thought, by the way.
So, yeah, I thought so too, although I think this chapter gave me a little bit more whiplash trying to follow Ivan Illich's train of thought. I thought from time to time I felt like I was being ejected from his train of thought until I could come back to it. So I think here last time we talked about he focused on language and the standardization of language and how language, he used the example or the historical event of this man Nebrija pleading to Queen Isabella to teach proper Castilian, standardized Castilian to the entire, to Spain, and the consequences of that ideology, so to speak. Here, I think Illich starts to move into the area of economics proper and social relationships, although it's still heavily, the chapter still talks quite a bit about language. But I think he starts off, again, after a little bit of a detour, he comes to the concept of the basic needs that were identified according to Illich, somewhere in the 8th century, in the Carolingian period, that the Church, the Catholic Church, started to articulate the concept of the basic needs of individuals that had to be provided by the clergy, essentially. And Illich is critical of that idea, the idea of this so-called professionalization of the provenance of goods to people. I mean, that's sort of an ongoing theme throughout his works, and I think he introduces it here in a particular angle. So he talks about this notion of basic needs that have to be provided, and then he goes back to the question of education and the education of language and the mother tongue being as a prime example of the basic needs that have to be, provided, inculcated, passed on in a professional manner to the people, to the masses, so to speak. And so the question of the mother tongue preoccupies him in this chapter. He thinks that the concept of a mother tongue is kind of an artificial thing. It's a sort of again imposed. He traces its history to a monastery or an abbey in Frankish lands in Germany in the 11th century, I think, as being opposed to the concept that we talked about before in the previous episode, the vernacular language, the languages that are completely organic, completely untaught, and that people can master on their own without any kind of formal education. And in fact, he thinks that throughout human history, most communities would speak, maybe more than one vernacular language, maybe 2 or 3, in order to communicate and trade with others and develop a life that he called the life of subsistence, which has, for him, positive connotations. For the standard economists today, has a negative connotation. Subsistence is barely above poverty, whereas for Illich, subsistence is what happens in the unhampered market, so to speak, the market where we're not dealing with what he calls formal exchanges, but just the natural way that human beings live a contented life. So, I mean, I think that's. Let me look at my notes here. If there's anything else that I want Uh, Maybe some, there's a little bit more, but maybe I'll leave it at that and see if anybody else has things to say or to add to what I'm saying. And then we'll see where we can perhaps push back or wonder or ask questions about what Illich has in mind. Go ahead, David.
Right. Well, no, I was going to bring you in first, Father Brad, I think, and then we'll go to Charlie, and then I'll come in because we had a short conversation about this yesterday.
Yeah. Well, for me, I found this chapter found it very enlightening. As an expansion of his second chapter that we read last week, he's such a master of using the concept of vernacular in an analogous way, and uses the example of language, of human language, and then this concept of the vernacular, then expands that out analogously to the very concept of a vernacular realm of society, a vernacular realm of human activity, abstracted from language specifically, just this vernacular realm of human activity that is unregulated and unstandardized. It's a realm of human activity that emerges from human culture and is not is precisely not standardized from the top down. And beginning with kind of this paradigmatic case of language, he kind of expands that to all of society, and then I think he's absolutely right, because he accurately sees that one of the fundamental fingerprints of the whole modern world, the modern project, is this attempt to standardize all of life. An attempt to standardize and, in a sense, render repetitive the entire sphere of human activity from birth to death. And that project brings with it great benefits. This kind of regularization of every aspect of human life, not just language, but also education in general. Education, free association, even religion, this tendency to over standardize it brings with it a great benefit, but oftentimes the modern world tends to have a blind spot, and that is what is lost in this over standardization. And what is lost in this over standardization is precisely that realm of free human activity, where human creativity and the human free and spontaneous response to the contingencies of life is able to flourish and respond to human need and create culture as a spontaneous, organized, evolving thing. We've lost that. In an attempt to standardize and regularize cultural activities, we've actually lost culture, and we've snuffed culture out. And this is what he talks about, the war against subsistence. The war against subsistence. And I think he's onto something there. I've never heard it spoken of that way. Like you mentioned, Michelle, subsistence. When we speak of subsistence, that's generally spoken of with negative connotations. But this idea of a war on subsistence for Illich is modernity's war on that sphere of human life and human activity in society, which is unstandardized. And Illich's insight that is precisely that realm where the true human freedom can flourish. I think he's right.
All right, we'll come back to that. Thank you, Father. Charlie, any first thoughts or reactions to what you just heard?
Yeah, it is an interesting analogy, this whole unpacking from, from the shift from the vernacular to a more institutionalized form of language, that's sort of, in Illich's view, the overarching or the root cause. It's sort of the meta technology which enables all these other forms of institution ready to flourish. As soon as you have the language, then you can do the rest. It's kind of like the old line that I think is attributed to, I don't know, one of the the wealthy banking heirs, maybe to John Rockefeller, sometimes the Rothschilds, and no one really knows, who said it or if anyone said it. But the line is, give me control over the money and or the money supply, and I'll be happy to, I'll have control in short order. And Illich is, even before that, you have authority, and where I think that Michel said sort of jolted him or gave him whiplash. I'm curious to find out why that is in a little more detail. And I think that for me, reading this, it's the you identify with the Western lineage of the church. Illich is making a pretty of something that's situated like right in the middle of that stream with the Carolingian dynasty, but in particular he puts it on a particular abbey, the Gorts, the Abbey of Gort, which sort of spread another technically the plow or some sort of a mechanized way of the horse, using a horse as a tractor, creates the conditions for villages, which I guess are the first social formation that really receives this new. So, Michel, what would you? Could you speak a little more to the feeling of, or just from trying to follow what he's saying?
Yeah, it was more from trying to follow what he's saying, because he, from the previous chapter, it seemed to, from the way he was presented it, that Nebriha was the beginning of this process of standardization. Then all of a sudden here he takes us back, several centuries to the Carolingian period. And without, he doesn't develop very much how it is or what it is that he sees in the Carolingian period that establishes the identification of basic needs that need to be provided by the clergy to the people. I think, at least if I recall here, I have the book in front of me, it seems to be a little sketchy. He just mentions it and we have to take it as a fact. And I don't have anything against it in particular, but it was kind of quick. And then from then on, he moves, as you mentioned, to the Abbey of Gordes just a few centuries later, because that's an event that's in the 11th century, or I can't remember exactly, a little bit. To me, there was a little bit of disconnection in the narrative. It reads very well, but if you start to reflect, I had to go back and reread exactly what he was how he's trying to guide our thoughts through this process. But I think that's a minor criticism. I didn't mean it, again, so maybe I use whiplash with positive connotations, not negative connotations. And I'm just, but there are things that he mentions that I think perhaps maybe either now, or he has a way of making a distinction when he talks about economic exchange between formal exchange and the vernacular exchange. And I wonder if there's a real distinction there. To what extent is there a real distinction? Is he imagining one? Did we not, didn't the people embrace, after all, the standardization? Didn't they accept it with open arms? Are the villains the institutions and the victims the people, or are they both essentially equally cooperating in the modernization of the world? So those are questions that I have.
Okay, perhaps I'll come in and give my thoughts and then react a little bit as well to what you said. So the sense I got from this is he painted a picture for me. It's a bit like a fountain, an ornate fountain, in which you have many, many spouts, each individually producing its stream of water, and it's dynamic, it's moving. But take a step back and you see this beautiful static pattern of order in the fountain. But it's not something that can be created except by allowing those individual expressions of the flow of water. And so he's describing this process of an emergent order, which you can look at to see that applies to the whole of a society, for example. But what he's saying is that what sustains that and enriches it and allows it to develop beautifully are these localized expressions of the culture, which come from individual freedom. And he does allow for, by the way, is the air conditioning on us? Hearing a lot of noise there. He does allow for, right, he does allow for certain natural institutionalizations of language, I can call it like that. So he says that that at certain times you had the person who used his local vernacular with his family, and then there was a language of trade, a language of law, and you get that pattern. I've often wondered how people traveled around the Roman Empire, or, they seem to be able to speak many languages and communicate, and we never hear people worrying about hiring interpreters or something. In biblical times, did it go on, or were people just always able to have some common languages as well? But what resonates with me with this picture is the extension of this by analogy to all aspects of human life, and that ultimately, if you try to impose that pattern of that you see of the fountain from a distance, you're actually stopping. You can't allow the dynamism at the local level, and it is that from which we get community, a sense of connection, and local cultures, which ultimately there's a dynamic process in these. Some of these will develop and start to affect others locally, and one of those vernaculars will also become the language of trade, for example. But then at a later age, that might die down and something else will arise. And he's describing this as an organic process in which there's a sort of hierarchy of languages, and one of them will be the language of the nation, but it becomes that organically. It's not the central government deciding. Now, I love this idea, and I think he's right. What worries me is this strain of that he seems to be negative about any form of standardization, and doesn't seem to acknowledge what is actually creating this beautiful order, and that is that there is a central authority that is good, and that is God. And that authority is manifested in the church when it acts in the person of Christ. And so his criticisms of the church as a human institution, very happy to accept. That has ever been the case. But I don't see enough acknowledgement of the good that's coming out of this. And what I'd say is that with standardization, with the principle of subsidiarity, I can allow for certain sort of levels of institution which work with different degrees of authority, some locally, some over a wider domain, as long as they stick to their functions. And again, I don't see an acknowledgement of that. So it ends up coming across, for all the good that's there, as a romanticization of the past and something that's very negative about the present. And this is a big problem with a lot of traditionally minded Catholics, actually. And it's funny because he probably was not seen as a traditionalist when he was around, because he was criticizing the church. But he actually, paradoxically, I would say, has that fault. Or should we say, if he doesn't, maybe he's just writing in reaction to his times. He doesn't offset what he says sufficiently strongly to acknowledge where this order is actually coming from, and that there is a need for some institutional emphasis or influence and authority. So I don't know, does anyone have any reaction to that? Does that...
David, I think you're your critique is actually spot on, because as we even talked about before, I think he's very good at really putting his thumb on the pulse of the evil of over standardization in the modern world. Yet, as in most critiques of anything, his own critique takes on a life of its own, and then he in many ways takes the critique too far in critiquing standardization in general, and then like exactly what you said, failure to see that true human society, that vernacular sphere, as he calls it, is actually rendered possible through a type of order, a divine order to God, which all society ought to have, ultimately a true society, all ordered towards the worship of God through the church. He kind of took his criticism. I think he took his criticism unjustly towards the church, which was a mistake. I think he overplayed that card, and it's very, very easy for social critics, to set up the past as either a straw man that they'd like to tear down, or as the fairy tale ideal that they would like to replicate. That's a very easy technique to use, and he used that technique, and everybody falls into that to a certain degree. He fell into that a little bit, and I think you're right in pointing it out. So did he take his critique a little bit too far? I think probably yes, David. I think you're right. He took his critique of standardization probably a little bit too far, but I think nonetheless his critique is valid. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard. I think you're right. I mean, David Cayley, his biographer and close friend and associate, would accept those criticism and would say that, he's a polemicist in a way. I mean, he's not offering his own system of. He's just, being very polemical, trying to just kick the whole mess that of modernity. There are passages in his writings where he would say, we need a balance. I don't want to tear down the whole of modern society and so forth and whatnot. But clearly, as you said, in his writing, it comes across as being very one-sided and maybe an idealization of the past. And to me, that is worth talking about a little bit more, because he is critical of the market. So he uses the term the market, the way the left would use it, right? The way the left criticizes the market. So he's critical of the market, and he sets up this dichotomy, or this contrast between the vernacular exchange and the formal exchange of the market. And I don't think that's very convincing, because the formal exchange of the market is free by definition. And I think what I said earlier, that it's not the top imposing this on the bottom as total victims. The bottom was more than happy to accept the standardization and the benefits that come with it, right? The material wealth and so forth. To some extent, at least, I don't think it's such a clear-cut. You can't separate the institution versus those who receive the services from the institutions, because they're not being coerced into receiving those services. By and large, I think they mostly go along with receiving the education, the standard teaching, the healthcare, the whatever it is, the transportation, the roads, all the things that throughout his career Illich will criticize one by one, the cheap energy and so forth. So there has to be a balance of subsidiarity, and that's actually very difficult to discover and to articulate, because in my mind, it's not actually a matter of balance. It's not a matter of self-restraint. There are areas of life that are properly under the governance of families or local communities, and others that are properly, more under the purview of higher institutions. and that has to be defined real well and real clearly. And currently, especially in our modern lives, we don't make those distinctions. And it's whoever can provide the service the most efficiently and at the lowest cost and whatnot. And I think that's wrong. But it's difficult to articulate exactly what it is that the state, the government, what is the scope of the government action. Properly speaking, what is the scope of family action, of community action, the city, and so forth. That's where I think one could build a new system. But I think Illich is primarily trying to just shake the whole thing up, and without being too careful about making those important distinctions.
I'd like to know what Illich would have thought of things like occupational licensing. The poor getting forced out of the new economy, as it were. Like you can imagine the hair braider who was earning a living just braiding people's hair in the community and pay an annual licensing fee to the cartel of established hair braiders and beauty salons. I think that there is kind of a parallel there where, the vernacular market, or if that's not quite the right term, but I think that, he writes that in the new dispensation, using a great religious term, the poor are no longer by their vernacular activities because they have only marginal or no access to the market. So there he's not using the term market pejoratively. He's saying that, the problem is that access under the new hierarchical modernization of poverty.
Right. So I think you're right. I don't think I think he would look unfavorably on occupational licensing, but interestingly, in his book on medicine, Medical Nemesis, or the Limits of Medicine, where he criticizes the healthcare system, he doesn't dwell too much on that aspect of things. Me, when I've criticized the market with the healthcare system, I start with occupational licensing, and I see it as the root of all evil. But I think Illich is correct in thinking that minds were changed even before licensing came about. So he's trying to look at something a little bit deeper, the mentalities of people. So licensing itself is it's only an expression, or a formal expression of a way of thinking about how society should be organized, as opposed to being the actual culprit itself. By the time you have licensing laws, the horse is out of the barn, so to speak.
If we go to the what was said last week, the strength of Illich for me is that he is attacking what we described last week as the problem of the modern age, this anxiety about chaos if people are left to their own devices. And he's saying, no, actually what happens is you get local order occurring, and then at each level above that, an order emerges appropriate to the level of authority that is there. And I think he's right about that. I do think he's right about the problems of snuffing out this freedom. So I just wanted to say that. And I agree with you also on that he seems to distinguish between, it's almost as if he is suspicious even of the sort of monetary exchange. I get the feeling when he talks about local exchange, I get the feeling that he imagined it's all going to happen through barter or something like this. And so what occurs to me is that he might, a lot of the current day distributists would be like this. He seems to, like the distributists, or my perception of them, he seems to accept the left-wing critique of capitalism, which I think is a mistake, or much of it anyway. And I can see why initially he was very popular in the 60s and 70s, because here he is criticizing the church. He seems to be a critic of capitalism and free markets, because he doesn't like markets at all, or that's what you're getting. But then when it comes down to it, he still must be at some level acknowledging the authority of God, and that's where I can see why eventually he fell foul of the left, because probably that he would temper what he was saying with the benign, the good influence of God that allows any of this to happen. Without that, there would be chaos. And the reason Illich isn't scared, whether he says it directly or not, is because he has faith, I would say. And this is where, and I just wish he would be more um, upfront, so that's more open about saying this, because I think that his argument rests on this very strongly. But it's assumed, it isn't articulated directly.
I think you're right. So one one thing I want to say that he doesn't. So he I thought of him when I first read him, many years ago, as being more of a man of the left, but he's not, and he's certainly not. I mean, he makes a jab here against the liberation theology, right? The Catholic Marxists. Here it was a sort of it's kind of funny. It's a funny passage in this chapter here. But his view of capitalism is primarily what we might call crony capitalism. He talks about the Chicago Boys and things like that. So where capitalism is always marred by its association with the state, to use it for its own purposes, and I don't think there's nothing that I've seen with him being familiar with the Austrian school economics that I'm sympathetic to, for example, where they are actually, I think they would be very sympathetic to what Illich has to say about, but it would present to Illich a view of the market that is not so negative, that maybe Illich cannot see. It can only see the market, it can only see capitalism via its association with the state, and doesn't see it right.
Yeah, Charlie was looking to come in there, Michel. Yeah, sorry. So, yeah. Go ahead, Charlie.
Yeah, I don't know that his problem is so much with the market a modern, institutionalized economy where you have multiple layers of production, or what the Austrians call the structure, where savings are channeled into longer term investments with intermediate capital that is built up to create more and more complex tech. Austrian school speaks of the structure of production as being the postponement of gratification to get more with less down the road. And I do actually know of one instance where Illich engaged with Austrian ideas, and it was this idea of the detour of production, or kind of longer and longer structures of production where you have to postpone consumption today and invest in some sort of capital to have more tomorrow. And Illich did seem to push back against this whole idea of the detour of production. And I'm not really clear exactly on why, but I think that it's probably connected to this romanticization, the preference for changes, but they're more at the level of, I have bread, you have fish, let's trade. And I think that this also kind of ties into the chapter where he's talking about the amount of energy that it takes to produce, a unit of some food commodity like wheat. And he points out that in the modern economy, maybe we get, but there's a lot more energy going into it throughout all the different stages of production than there would have been in, say, ancient Greece. And then he makes the analogy between energy and all the into producing, to the even greater amount of energy that we sink into education. Sort of interesting to think of it, the distortion, or the way that we route so much of our effort into these institutions of education and sort of formal tutoring. And if we step back and say, is this actually a worthwhile expenditure? I think that question can take us in some interesting directions.
Yeah, actually, you brought up something there that we haven't touched on, and that is his discussion of education as a process of teaching rather than a process of learning, is the way I describe it. And it has often struck me, and again, the problem here. I'm just thinking of my own thoughts about education. That it always struck me that if education is viewed as what is taught in the classroom alone, then it is by definition, or it will automatically become a process whereby learning and wisdom are reduced, because nobody can pass on 100% of what they know. So the student will learn less than the teacher, and that student will in turn will pass on less to the next one, and it will degrade in time, inevitably. But what offsets this is the fact that the end of education, of a good education, is actually divine wisdom and opening up the individual to grace. And this is the process whereby the student can be greater than the teacher. So and this struck me in the context of art, for example, in that there was a teacher called Pacheco, who was very influential in 17th century Spain, and he taught most of the famous artists. He even wrote a textbook on the role of the Christian in art and an instruction manual on art. Very few people today know about Pacheco, but his most famous student is Velázquez, who surpassed anything that Pacheco did in terms of painting by orders of magnitude. So where does that additional element come from? Well, actually, it was written in the manual that Pacheco wrote. He talked about the role of art being one that's directed towards God, and it is for the Christian a virtue that's inspired by God. And through that, the student can develop more. And I think that, again, Illich has highlighted the problem of modern education. It's viewed as a training, that's why everything's being dumbed down, because there is they don't even acknowledge the possibility of grace, because they don't believe God exists. It isn't, and even in Catholic institutions, it's paid, lip service is paid to it, but the curricula are not designed around this, which actually should be central to the whole process of learning. And I think that the value of the learning through the family and the vernacular, which he describes, where people just pick it up naturally, is what they're seeing is examples of people doing things, but there's an exchange of love that is there because it's in community. And that is what is allowing the development of something greater as a result of this. Now, that can be incorporated, I think, into institutional structures. I think it can. But if you're not acknowledging that great value of how education occurs, as opposed to teaching, shall we say, that in the vernacular, then you have a problem.
No, I think that's absolutely right, and I don't think he sees it. Again, as Charlie said, he seems to be very enamored with the idyllic vernacular life. But I think what you're saying, David, is that there can be. We can discover through the worship of God and the love of God in education. We can discover forms. We can be more systematic in understanding things about the world that can then be passed on in a more objective, if you will, way. And I think Illich seems to reject any kind of formalization of knowledge that can be passed on. I don't know if I'm being correct. Maybe his writings, he's too vague. I mean, he's writing because it's not systematic. It's hard to pin him down on certain thoughts. But at least the impression that I have is that he wants it completely free and free of any kind of institutional structure. He wants society to be free of any kind of institutional structure, when in fact once proper laws, if you will, of divine laws are identified, and we want to pass them on. I mean, there's a way of doing this in a more systematic way that can be more efficient and passed on to more people. That is good. That is not necessarily bad, right? So the efficiency of the institutions are not necessarily bad if they pass on good things in a good way. That doesn't do injustice to the freedom of the individual.
In other words, if they act according to their proper end, which and yeah, but that of course is always going to be a difficult area, and there's always going, that therein lies the problem as well, because it'd be always difficult to define it. There's going to be it will introduce difficulties and error as well. I think you can't escape it.
I disagree with everything that you guys have said, particularly. I mean, David, I agree with you. Also, it's hard to pin Illich down simply because of the way he writes. It's almost as if he's thinking out loud, in a sense. And I think I even mentioned to you guys last week, in this sense, he's a classic continental thinker, in a certain sense. So he has a series of, like, this whole constellation of insights that he's weaving together in kind of this tapestry. And it's hard to actually pin down exactly where his conclusion is, if he even has a conclusion himself. And for me, I don't think he has a specific conclusion that he's bringing his reader to. I really don't. I think what he has is a general polemic against the standardization of the modern world. I also can sense in his writing a little bit of I think he's just soaked in a little bit too much of the Marxian economic thought, and I think his critique of the market, or the supposed critique of the market, just comes from this. I think his use of the concepts of exchange value and use value and all of this stuff. It seems to me like it's just he was just using the tools at his disposal, which in his time and in his place, it was just a complete Marxist critique of the market, I think, is what he was coming from. But I think even through that, he's able to see the value, exactly what you were talking about, David, the value of this emergent order and this beautiful order of society. That's something that precisely cannot be planned from the top down, or cannot be standardized, or even predicted. And I think in this kind of mix of insights that he does have and critique about society, I think that's his fundamental. That's the fundamental takeaway for me. Just like what you said, David, is that there is a vernacular sphere of human activity where society as an emergent order exists, and this is precisely something that must remain beyond the reach of technocratic, modernized industrial standardization. It must, by definition, remain beyond the reach. It's like once an industrial mechanized society tries to regulate human society and standardize human society, it will, by that very virtue, destroy human society. It will destroy the fundamental human element in society. I think that's my main takeaway from Illich. I think he's
right. I think you're absolutely correct. And in fact, he has, I think, what is a very prescient critique of, and I think it can be addressed to both the left and the right, at least the common right, in terms of their attempt to eradicate poverty, quote unquote. So the war on poverty. He has. I'm going to read a passage here. He says, "So far, every single attempt to substitute a universal commodity for a vernacular value has led not to equality, but to a hierarchical modernization of poverty." And I think he's absolutely right. There was a movie made not long ago called Poverty, Inc. that was very critical of all these non-profit organizations from the West going to Africa to help the poor and whatnot. And they sustain themselves more than they do anything else to the poor. And the poor are, on the contrary, they're sort of almost... what's the word? They're imprisoned in this system. I mean, they're left out of the economy. They're engaged in this poverty that is perpetuated by this effort from the institutions to try to eradicate poverty, when in fact all they do is perpetuate it. And he saw that back in the 1980s, which is
Well,
remarkable.
because these institutions need the power.
Right, correct. Yeah, exactly.
I couldn't agree with you more. Michelle. That was exactly one of the things, one of the exact lines that I had highlighted. I think he's spot on, and this is why I think his insights go beyond even the tools that he had at his disposal, the social critique at his disposal in the 60s and 70s, because it's precisely the poor that need that spontaneous order of society. It's precisely the poor, the middle class and the underclass, the ones that don't have necessarily the market means of consumption. It's precisely those people that rely on that spontaneous order that exists in the vernacular realm of subsistence. To attempt to regulate and standardize this human organic vernacular realm is precisely to snuff out the subsistence of the poor, the subsistence of the common man. And this is why, for me as a Catholic and as a Catholic priest, I was always attracted to the writings of writers like Chesterton and all of these guys who really had a care for the common man and an insight that the common man and the poor have a value of society that must remain beyond the reach of industrial standardization.
Right, and there's he ends the chapter with kind of a poignant story about a friend of his or some friends of his who were eager to help the poor and had decided to live in the slums of the Bronx or some place in New York, and he says that, but not understanding this distinction, all they wanted to do was teach to poor kids in the slum the mother tongue, and in fact, he said mother tongue is taught increasingly not by paid agents, but by unpaid parents. So these parents that try to just impose this standard structure onto their children or onto their communities around them instead of letting them.
The danger of the imposed structure is that the imposed structure, impersonal as it is, becomes a type of tyrant. The structure itself becomes a type of tyrant. I forget the name of the person, but Menke, I forget the author, but the famous quote, a desire to help the poor is almost always a veiled attempt to control them. But now, of course, that's pessimistic. It sounds pessimistic, but it probably is far more pessimistic than reality would bear out. But I think there's a truth there. That so often in fallen human nature, a desire to save humanity or help humanity is nothing but a masquerading desire to control them. And in an attempt to control, it's also ultimately to snuff out.
Yeah, and he's not romanticizing poverty. Let's make that clear. He wants to alleviate human suffering, but he's just saying the attempts to do so in this way are actually not even allowed. They're moving them below subsistence. In other words, a level of human dignity, even if they have money, which is not one of proper human existence, I would say.
Yeah, it's subsistence versus dependence.
Okay. All right. Yeah. And subsistence is the first step towards proper living, that you can move up from that, I would say. If that's his argument, then I think he's right.
Yeah, I don't know. I think he wants to stay at subsistence. For him, subsistence is the Garden of Eden, perhaps.
Well, in that case, I think that's his problem again. I think that I think you're always looking for an improvement, but you need the alternative to subsistence is not, as I think his father said, not dependence, which is what they're creating. Charlie, you're listening there. Anything that occurs to you?
Yeah, there's part of me that subsistence, and there's part of me that enjoys taking showers. I wonder if we can have a sort of progressive form where we're never just, running faster and faster to stay in the same place, as some people feel in the modern economy, but where we can still enjoy a lot, the fruits of, and that includes an energy-intensive society. I do think that it's nice to have even things like internal combustion engines, and I wouldn't do away with those if I could. but who knows? Maybe
Well,
they're
from my read of Illich, he's not necessarily even falling into those categories. I think for him, subsistence is different than what we might even speak of in the modern world of subsistence as merely living almost hand to mouth. I think when he, I think what I have I can't pin him down. Like I said, he's a very hard thinker to pin down. You must read him on his own terms. You must read him on his own terms. I think when he's talking about subsistence, is the realm of, I would almost describe it as a human self-sufficiency or human reliance. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, I think.
Rather than being dependent, on an external structure, what he's talking about subsistence is not simply having 3 acres and a mule, because as in that category, but as having a sphere of autonomy and a sphere of independence from an external regulating structure.
In other words, the first basic rung of independence that possesses human dignity.
I don't necessarily think for him the idea of subsistence is coterminous with our notion of poverty. I wouldn't say that.
No, right. I agree with you, but at the same time, I think what Charlie was mentioning earlier, that he wants, it seems that he wants all economic exchange to be personal, right? Where there's a sort of a, as opposed to letting the free market be impersonal, and still free, right? I mean, the free market can still be free, but can be impersonal, and so in that sense, to me, perhaps he's a little romanticizing. Now, of course, he tries to make his points by bringing us back in time to maybe a situation where the vernacular did exist, when in fact it probably never existed. And I think he would be the first to admit that it never did exist. So that's yeah. I mean, he's hard to read in that sense, and we have to. But I think you're right. He's not wanting us to be poor. He wants us to be free. But his insistence on the personal relationships, and I think we may see that later in this book, or maybe if we do some other readings of his, will become a little bit more clear when he appeals a lot to the parable of the Good Samaritan, and he has his own view of how it should be interpreted. And so for him, I think personal relationships are always very important, and perhaps are the end-all be-all of human existence. Which, if that's the case, that would sort of limit. I mean, in essence, compared to how we live now, it would seem poor. It would be materially more poor, I think, because their material abundance seems to require at least some efficiency and institutions that are less personal, that can just, bring about prosperity sort of automatically.
I'm going to throw something at you that I just remember. It's an observation that I made years ago. I don't even know if it's true, but I'll just throw it at you and see whether it corresponds to this pattern. The pattern of success of people in the US is what always struck me is that the people who succeed are not the sort of third, fourth, fifth generation Americans so much. The people who really affect and enrich American society are those first immigrants that come in. It's the people who have an awareness of the culture they came from, as well as American culture. And it seems that the structure of the US culture allows these vernaculars. So you think of, I don't know, Jewish culture, for example, existing within the American. And when it still had its character, that allowed them to enrich very strongly the US. And you think now of, I don't know, in the tech world, a lot of people from the Indian subcontinent, for example, coming in and succeeding and doing a lot of sort of innovation. And maybe that the US, through its immigration of skilled people, is actually sort of reinvigorating its vernacular on a constant basis. But what happens by the time you get into the third, fourth, fifth generation, everybody's the same. And that basically what they're contributing to is the fertile ground for these immigrants to come in and enrich the society. Is that fair, do you think, or is it too broad a sweeping observation?
I think there's a truth there. There's definitely a truth that you're pointing to, even if it's maybe slightly too broad of a generalization, but there's a truth.
There's another one I'm going to throw at you then. And this is a totally different one. I'd like to know your reaction to this. So, thinking of the vernacular and standardized language, of course, the big one, literally in regard to language, is the language of the church. So, the language of the church is Latin. And I think this centralization of language would be something on the face of it that Illich would criticize. But I would say that there is no vernacular without the Latin there, that actually you need that standardization of language to articulate the things that the church as the body of Christ can articulate, which is dogma, doctrine, and then also the standard for the liturgy. But then you should have alongside that, you should encourage vernacular expressions as well, and allow freedom for those to work within the church. And so
I think the church's standardization of a language of worship that became a unifying force all throughout Christendom was one of the great blessings of the modern world. It was one of the conditions that allowed for the flourishing of the modern world, where you had intellectuals from all over the continent in England in the Middle Ages who probably could not have a conversation with each other if they met, were able to exchange letters through a written language, which was Latin. And even in his second chapter, he talked about the reality of Christopher Columbus himself being fluent in two languages that he was not able to, in which he was not able to write, yet he could write in two different languages. So it was a language of writing and a language of speaking. In the same way that there'd be a language of trade in society and a language of common speech, there was also a language for worship, language for worshiping God, and the language for worshiping God became a unifying force.
Okay, so maybe it is appropriate to the end of worship to have a unifying language. Then maybe that's you don't need the local vernaculars, or perhaps it's both and.
I completely agree with you. I am in favor of a separate language for worship.
And by the Illich argument, we would become, if we grew up with it and we learnt it in the context of our homes and our families, that aspect of worship, we would become fluent in it, even if we couldn't write it, as you say. We could hear it and would understand it in the context of the worship, is what he's saying, which is interesting. I don't know that he was a traditionalist, though. In that sense, but what we're doing is we're supporting the traditionalist argument here. So that's very, very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, well, nor am I. I'm not a traditionalist Catholic either. But I recognize. But that doesn't mean I don't recognize the value of having the value of having a language set aside, a unique language set aside for worship, as being a very powerful force, not only for the worship of God, but also to unify religious faith and culture.
And it might be that today's lingua franca is actually English. That, there's
certainly the language of the internet and the language of exchange.
So it's English plus your local language. So, which is nice for me, but that means I can't communicate in the vernacular. I need to learn a bit more vernacular. I'll brush up on my vernacular language. Okay, any concluding comments? We're going for an hour. Very interesting again. Charlie, do you have anything you'd like to say or add? No? Okay.
I think if we pursue this to the next chapter, just the next one I think will be a little detour. I mean, it'll be less about language. The title of it is Research by People. And I think it's a very interesting chapter as well. So I look forward to that
Okay.
conversation next week.
This approach to looking at things, this is what we're really learning, can be applied to almost any human sphere of activity. That's what's so interesting about it. And it seems to, and I think that the insights that Illich has when he points out the flaws, I think he's right in many cases, are there in nearly every aspect of society. I think this is what's so interesting about this little booklet, actually, that he brought to our attention, Michel. So thank you very much. And with that, we'll finish. Great to see you, gentlemen. Great to hear you. And we'll meet again next week.